Hello, this is my presentation on Custer Died for Your Sins, an Indian Manifesto by Vine Deloria Jr. The main questions I'll be covering are, how does Vine Deloria Jr. define the differences between black calls for civil rights and indigenous calls for sovereignty? What are some of the similarities between the two movements for social justice? What is Vine Deloria's conclusion on the ideal collaboration between the two movements given an understanding of their differences? My methods and argument will be to begin with a brief introduction of Custer Died for Your Sins and a few notes about the author. My argument will be that while black and indigenous folks' call for justice share many similarities, America's forced inclusion of indigenous folks into society, as juxtaposed to black folks' forced exclusion, highlights a key difference. While indigenous exploitation revolved around land and resources, black exploitation revolved around human labor. The conclusion is that it's imperative that black and indigenous folks collaborate to achieve social resource justice on all fronts. But collaboration must occur within the innate understanding that each group is oppressed in different ways. Thus, each movement must be curtailed to the interests of the group so that their individual goals can be accomplished. Our author is Vine Deloria Jr. He's a Standing Rock Sioux and an indigenous American who was born in South Dakota in 1933. He grew up around the Oglala Lakota Pine Ridge Indian Reservation, eventually graduating from Iowa State with a degree in science. Served as the executive director of the National Congress of American Indians in 1964. During his term, the organization went from bankrupt with 19 tribes to economic surplus and 156 tribes. He's a prolific advocate for indigenous sovereignty without assimilation, and composed Custer in 1969. The Red and the Black. The Red and the Black is the 8th chapter of Custer and largely discusses the similarities and differences of the black and indigenous movements. Deloria begins by noting that movements for racial equity were often focused on specifically black justice and often overlooked indigenous sovereignty. To the Indian people, it had seemed quite unfair that churches and government agencies concentrated their efforts primarily on blacks. By defining the problem as one of race and making race refer solely to black, Indians were systematically excluded from consideration. In the above quote, it's clear that Deloria views the black movement for civil rights as one that was not particularly productive for indigenous folks. While some social new programs allowed for indigenous inclusion, they were still generally black-oriented programs which had been adapted to include Indians. Why were indigenous folks forgotten? While the black civil rights movement of the 1960s gained worldwide attention and resulted in enormous demonstrations, the movement for indigenous folks was far less acknowledged. This may be due to the fact that, in many states in the last century, Indians were classified as white by laws passed to exclude blacks, so there was a connotation that Indians in some way might be like whites. In other aspects, such as marriage laws, Indians were classified as black. In overall race relations, however, indigenous folks were still considered non-white. In attempts to exclude, subtly, the indigenous folks and other minorities from joining the civil rights movement, the government and interest groups categorized indigenous folks as good guys who have too much dignity to demonstrate. In reality, this seemingly positive reputation was used to dissuade indigenous folks from joining the movement. Here, I've outlined some key differences between the movements. The black civil rights movements involved mostly black folks, sought to unravel racialized laws regarding where black folks can and cannot thrive. Blacks were never considered white or white passing under any conditions. The civil rights movement gained far more attention nationally and internationally. It focused on acceptance and full integration into American society, rather than yearning for sovereignty or separation from it. In contrast, here are some qualities of the indigenous calls for sovereignty. Indigenous folks were able to work through and be officially recognized by the government through bureaus and reservations. Indigenous folks were sometimes granted the rights of white folks, though in the majority of instances were definitely not. Indian people have the opportunity to deal with the rest of the world as a corporate body. Blacks, on the other hand, are not defined by their own community. They do not receive the deference tribes receive because they are not government entities. Some closing thoughts and Deloria's solution to the idea that blacks and indigenous folks must collaborate. Deloria views having a separate cultural space as essential to thriving as a people. Indigenous folks have reservations that have economic structures and are legally recognized by the government. Thus, they have a space where they can socially isolate and support their creative and innovative interests. In contrast, Deloria critiques the black movement, stating that they need a homeland where they can withdraw, drop the facade of integration, and be themselves. One of Deloria's key distinctions is that he views the black movement as trying to integrate into white society, as opposed to deintegrate and form their own cultural spaces where they can breathe freely. He believes that the Indigenous movement has done a better job of this because they've accomplished reservations and other cultural spaces where they can form their own innovative interests without being directly legally influenced by the rest of the United States. Finally, Deloria's primary hesitation to black and Indigenous collaboration is that Indians will not work within an ideological basis which is foreign to them. The future, therefore, will depend primarily on whether white and black begin to understand Indian nationalism. Through Custer Died for Your Sins, it's clear that Vine Deloria Jr. draws some key distinctions between the black civil rights movement and Indigenous calls for sovereignty. His primary distinction and his hesitation for why Indigenous folks might not initially want to engage in the movement is that he doesn't view the black civil rights movement as properly encapsulating the motives of Native Americans. He thinks that Indigenous folks want their own cultural space, whereas black folks are trying to integrate into white society. The only situation in which Vine Deloria Jr. views collaboration between the two groups as possible is if the black civil rights movement can more adequately recognize the interests of Indigenous folks, as opposed to primarily focusing on the interests of black folks. Thank you. This was my presentation on Custer Died for Your Sins.